This is your macroeconomic video on liquidity preference. We've talked about the word liquid before in videos, and the most liquid way for you to hold your assets or wealth is in cash. Other things are really similar to cash, like a debit card. Your savings account is fairly liquid, but you can also have your wealth wrapped up in things like stocks or bonds or real estate, which are a little bit harder to use to purchase goods and services because you'd have to liquidate them or turn them into cash before you could spend them. So we're going to talk a little bit about liquidity preference, which is the money demand line on your money supply and demand graph. So basic talk about the interest rate. When we're talking about the interest rate in the economy, we're generally talking about the nominal interest rate. This is actually the exact same thing as the federal funds rate. Remember, the federal funds rate is the rate that banks can borrow loaned money from other competitor banks. It is the exact same thing as the nominal interest rate, and you can either use little I for nominal interest rate or FFR for federal funds rate. The real interest rate is generally used a little r to mean real interest rate, and that is just the federal funds rate minus inflation. So I adjusts on our money supply and money demand graph based upon the supply and demand of money in the economy. Because some economists use both little I and little r interchangeably on your money and supply and demand graph, you can use either one to label the vertical axis of your graph. Technically, the little I is more correct, but your textbook uses little r for both real and nominal interest rate. So the money supply is vertical and it's fixed because there's a monopoly on the printing of money. Only the central bank of a country has the ability to print fiat currency. If there was a free market for printing currency, it would be an upward sloping supply line. But that is not true for the printing of fiat money. Money demand, however, reflects how much the individual public wants to hold their wealth in liquid or cash form. So money demand is determined by liquidity preference. So just for a basic example here, let's suppose that households can hold their wealth in two ways. They can either keep it in cash. Now, if you keep your money in cash, it's very liquid, it's easy to spend, but you get no interest on that. If you're just holding your cash in a shoebox in your house, you're not earning any interest on it, and it is just kind of sitting there. You could also do things like buy stocks and bonds, which are forms of savings. Now, you get interest on a bond, and it pays out over time, but it's not liquid. You can't use it to buy groceries. In fact, you would have to sell it off early or wait for it to mature in order to get the cash out. So this is the opportunity cost of holding money in liquid form or in something like a bond. So a household's money demand is not about your demand for more wealth. It's about how you want to hold the wealth you have. Do you prefer it in liquid assets, which would be an increase in money demand, or do you want to put it in other forms of savings like bonds and stocks? So let's say that prices are going up. Everything else is equal, including your income. So if your income stays the same and prices rise, suddenly your purchasing power or real wealth is lower than it was before. This is the wealth effect. This is going to cause money demand to rise. As we move from the wealth effect into the interest rate effect, remember, some people have to pay the same amount of rent, buy the same amount of groceries, pay the same amount of medications if their income has stayed the same, even as prices rise. So if you have to do that, you're going to need more cash to pay the same amount of bills. And that leads us to a demand increase in money demand. So people go to the bank, they take extra money out of their savings, or they sell off their assets like stocks and bonds and remove money from the bank. That causes money demand to rise. And when money demand rises on your money supply and demand graph, it causes your nominal interest rate to rise. If real GDP goes up while incomes and prices have stayed the same, then money demand is also going to rise. Real GDP rising means that people are making more money, people are employed. That means people are generally doing well, and they're going to be making more purchases. If the interest rate rises while everything else stays the same, like price level and income and real GDP, then people tend to save more or put money into the bank, buy stocks and bonds. This makes money demand shift to the left or fall. When people decide to take cash out of the bank, they are spending money or holding it in cash. That shifts money demand to the right. And when people want to put money into the bank or save it by buying bonds, then money demand falls. We're going to do active learning number 3 now. So in A, B, and C, they've given you some issues where interest rate, real GDP, and or price level are changing, and they want you to determine what happens to money demand.